Okay, so I'm sending you this today. This will be the assignment for Wednesday and Thursday in trig class. And just kind of building off what we already know, but yet we got to use our calculator now instead of what we've memorized. So pointing out that how do I know I'm going to use the calculator? Well, it says find all the solutions to the nearest degree for the interval 0 to 360. So I am not going to have memorized answers in degrees, okay? And that's okay. So I'm going to proceed solving this equation just like starting with 1 here, just like we've done in the past. I want to gather all my signs to one side. So if I take 7 sine minus 1 sine, I'd have 6 sine. Plus 8 equals 10. And then I'm going to minus the 8. So 6 sine equals 2. And then we're going to divide by 6. And we get sine of x to equal, I'll even just reduce that to 1/3. And at this point, we probably don't recognize what 1/3 turns into for an angle. So we will have to ask our calculator to inverse sine 1/3 and have your calculator in degree mode because we're trying to find the answer in degrees. And then second sine 1/3 tells me that's 19 degrees. So now we will consider where sine actually is a positive 1/3 at. Sine is positive in 1 and sine is positive in 2. So 19 degrees for a reference angle in 1 is 19, and 19 degrees for a reference angle in 2 is 180 minus 19. So it'd be 161. So the difference here between yesterday's and today's is that yesterday we were basing things off of pi, but today we are basing things off of 180 and trying to get to that actual location. All right, number 11 can actually be worked in 2 ways, and I might show you both ways here. The first thing I recognize is that this is a square term, and this is a square term. So now what we have is the difference of 2 squares. And the difference of 2 squares factors into 5 cosine, 5 cosine, and the factors of 1 are 1 and 1. And so the only difference in the difference of squares is that one of these is positive and one of them is negative. And now we can say that each one of those factors set equal to 0 has a solution. And so we'll solve each one of these independently. The cosine of x equals negative 1/5. And I think if you followed that same process over here, you would find out that the cosine of x equals positive 1/5. Now we want a reference angle, and so the reference angle I'm going to go get is going to be based off of the inverse cosine of a positive 1/5. Do not put a negative in here, inside here, ever really if you want a reference angle, because if you put the negative in there, it's going to actually give you one of the answers, and that can get very, very confusing. We would like to always get the reference angle. So if I inverse cosine 1/5, I get an angle of 78 degrees. That's my reference angle. And I will then locate where cosine is positive and where cosine is negative. In other words, all 4 quadrants. 78 degrees in quadrant 1 is 78 degrees. 78 degrees in quadrant 2 would actually be 180 minus 78. 78 degrees in quadrant 3 would actually be 180 plus 78. and 78 degrees in quadrant 4 would actually be 360 minus 78. So we'll just go back through and run those calculations in. 180 minus 78 is 102. 180 plus 78 is 258. And 360 minus 78 is 282. And there are all of our solutions to problem number 11. Okay, so now if you were watching that last problem, number 11, what I'm going to do here on number 12 is just work it a different way. You can actually take this one, just like on 11, you could have added a 1, okay, and got 36 sine squared equals 1, divided by 36. I don't necessarily really like this way because of what we tend to do. We tend to forget this next step. We'll square root both sides, all right, but what we forget is that there should be a positive and a negative symbol attached to that square root, because you actually have two answers that you could square to get 1 over 36. So we got to remember this part in blue, that there's two answers. Okay, and then the square root of 1 over the square root of 36, two answers, is 1 over 6, two answers. So I have the sine of x equals positive and negative 1/6. Now I'm going to inverse sine 1/6 and figure out my reference angle. Inverse sine 1/6 is, well, it rounds to 10 degrees. Okay, so get some room here. Rounds to 10 degrees. And we know that we want to be where sine is positive, all and students. Where sine is negative, take and calculus. And so 10 degrees in each of those places. Quadrant 1, 10 degrees. Quadrant 2, 180 minus 10. Quadrant 3, 180 plus 10. Quadrant 4, 360 minus 10. And there are your four answers. Okay, number 13 doesn't look like it's tricky, but it is tricky. So I'm gonna absolutely write everything down I think this could factor into, and then we'll have a discussion as to why I know one is better than the other. So let's say that we saw this as a trinomial. The way you make 6 is to do 6 times 1, or the way you make 6 is to do 3 times 2. The way you make 1 is to do 1 times 1. Thank goodness there aren't a lot of options to making that, so 1 and 1 are in the other one as well. Now, it's the firsts that make the first, we're going to get 6. It's the lasts that make the last, we're going to get 1. But it's the O and the I of FOIL that help us create this middle term called -5. Okay, so let's see. If the outsides and insides were to meet, that would be 6 and 1, and we're trying to get it to be -5. Well, look at here. If these outsides and insides were trying to meet, it'd be 3 and 2 that are also trying to make -5. Now, what's confusing is both of these conditions look like they're going to be able to make -5, so which one is it? Well, let's explore a little further. If I were to make a -5 with a 6 and a 1, I'd have to have the 6 be negative and the 1 be positive. If I were to make a -5 with the 3 and the 2, I'd have to have them both be negative so that when you add two negatives together, you get to a -5. What we realize is that we wished to multiply to make -1. The only way you can multiply to make -1 is to have alternate signs. In other words, you cannot have the same sign, a negative and a negative, to get a negative. So that tells me that this option right here is the one that we want to use because I've got one of each sign. So I want to use the negative here and the positive here. Once I've figured that out, I'm going to put sign in here and do all my work from that point on with that one. So we take each fraction, or each factor, and try and set each factor equal to 0. I think you will reach a point on this that says the sine of x equals negative 1/6. And you'll reach a point on this one that says the sine of x equals 1. Okay? Now, I know this says negative 1/6, but when I go to inverse sine, I am only going to inverse the sine of the positive value 1/6, because I want my calculator to give me basically the first quadrant reference angle, and I don't want it to try and give me an answer. So if I inverse sine 1/6, I get 10. degrees. And so now where is sine negative at? In quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. So we would be talking about 180 plus 10 and 360 minus 10. Okay, and on this one we could inverse sine 1, and it is 90. So our three answers are 190, 350, and 90. I have not worked any of the problems out on this page for you, but by all means, if you have any questions on this one or the next page, you can email me back and I'd be glad to work them out and send them to you. So just let me know how this is going. We will also do more of this work on Thursday in class, so if you're going to be here Thursday, that's great too. Thanks and have a great day.